In April 1945, as the Third Reich crumbles, Field Marshal Walter Model's 325,000 German troops are ensnared in the Ruhr Pocket, facing certain destruction or the terrifying prospect of Soviet capture. An unofficial, life-saving directive spreads like wildfire. Yield to the first American U-spot. This is the harrowing tale of an army's desperate race for survival, abandoning ideology to seek mercy in American captivity and escape the feared horrors of the Red Army, culminating in one of history's most extraordinary mass surrenders. The spring of 1945 in Germany was not merely a season, it was an epical transition, a symphony of destruction reaching its deafening climax, marking the brutal twilight of a totalitarian regime. Across the ravaged landscape, the global conflagration that had consumed nations and reshaped continents was rapidly drawing to its close, yet the fighting remained as ferocious, as desperate, as unforgiving as any that had preceded it. The Allied forces, a seemingly unstoppable tide of steel, firepower, and human determination, surged across the Rhine, signifying that the final act of the European war was being written, not in grand pronouncements, but in the grim, visceral reality of fire and blood, of collapsing cities and shattered lives. The crossing of the Rhine itself was far more than a tactical victory. It was a profound psychological breach, a symbolic shattering of Germany's last great natural defensive barrier. With each meter gained by the Allied advance, the Führer's grandiose, nightmarish vision of a 1,000-year Reich receded further, dissolving into the chilling realm of utter futility and impending doom. On April 1, 1945, a date ironically devoid of any comfort for the beleaguered German defenders, American forces executed a daring and decisive maneuver. Capitalizing on their unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a stroke of luck that provided an invaluable, if temporary, foothold across the formidable river, they began to fan out rapidly, establishing and consolidating a robust bridgehead. This was no isolated incident, no minor skirmish. Concurrently, in a meticulously planned and flawlessly executed offensive known as Operation Plunder, other powerful Allied armies, including the British, Canadian, and significant elements of the American Ninth Army, launched massive coordinated crossings further north. The combined, concerted effort unleashed a devastating pincer movement, a vice grip designed to sever and encircle. The American First Army, driving fiercely and relentlessly from the south, and the American Ninth Army, pushing with equal resolve and speed from the north, sliced through the German lines with a precision and momentum that left their desperate opponents reeling. On that fateful April 1st, near the city of Lippstadt, these two mighty pincers met, their steel jaws snapping shut around the industrial heartland of Germany. The Ruhr Pocket was sealed, a colossal trap sprung, imprisoning hundreds of thousands. Within this newly formed cauldron, a staggering 325,000 German troops found themselves irrevocably trapped, cut off from any hope of reinforcement or escape. It was a motley, desperate collection, a poignant tableau of an army in its death throes. There were the battle-scarred infantry divisions of the Wehrmacht, their ranks tragically thinned by years of brutal, unforgiving fighting on multiple, unforgiving fronts, now critically undersupplied, outmaneuvered, and utterly outmatched. Beside them were the anti-aircraft crews from the Luftwaffe, once operating sophisticated flak guns in defense of the Reich's skies, now reduced to desperate foot soldiers, often armed with little more than bolt-action rifles, their aerial supremacy a distant, painful memory. Then there were the fanatical but ill-equipped Volkssturm militia, a tragic mix of elderly men and barely trained boys, a testament to Hitler's last-ditch delusional fanaticism, armed with obsolete weapons and imbued with a boundless, yet ultimately futile, ideological fervor. Finally, a bewildered assortment of rear area staff, administrative personnel, and support units, who had never once anticipated finding themselves on the front lines, let alone encircled in a desperate, dying pocket, stared at an inevitable, grim end. Their situation was dire beyond measure, a stark, undeniable illustration of an army bleeding out, cut off, outgunned, and facing a crushing, predetermined fate. At the very epicenter of this colossal catastrophe was Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, Model was a man whose military acumen had once earned him the formidable moniker Hitler's fireman, for his uncanny ability to stabilize collapsing fronts and rally demoralized troops. A highly respected tactician, known for his stubborn defense and personal bravery, Model now found himself in an utterly impossible position. His once formidable forces were reduced to a fragmented, demoralized, and starving shell. He was cut off from any effective communication with Berlin, isolated from the crumbling command structure of the Third Reich, which itself was disintegrating under the Allied onslaught. With Allied armies closing in from all sides, his trapped troops were running dangerously low on every vital commodity necessary to sustain a fighting force: fuel for the few remaining vehicles that had not been abandoned or destroyed, food for the starving soldiers whose bellies ached with constant hunger, and ammunition for their increasingly desperate and futile resistance. The choice before him was not one of strategic brilliance, but of grim, agonizing necessity. Continue a hopeless, bloody, and ultimately suicidal fight to the last man, or acknowledge the inevitable and somehow pave the way for his men's survival. The immense weight of command in such total defeat was a burden few could bear, and Model, a man of unwavering loyalty to his soldiers if not to a collapsing ideology, faced his ultimate, personal test. Inside the rapidly shrinking confines of the Ruhr Pocket, life had devolved into a grim, primal struggle for mere existence. The once bustling industrial heartland of Germany, a symbol of its economic might, lay deeply scarred by years of relentless Allied bombing raids, and was now further ravaged by the desperate, destructive, and retreating battles fought within its shrinking perimeter. It offered little solace, only ruins and scarcity. Scarcity was the pervasive, suffocating reality that gripped every soldier. Fuel, once the unquestioned lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare, was almost non-existent. This critical shortage meant tanks and trucks, once symbols of blitzkrieg power, now stood abandoned or became static pillboxes, their crews often forced to ditch their vehicles and continue on foot, blending into the growing tide of infantry. Food rations dwindled from meager to non-existent, compelling soldiers to forage desperately in the ruins of towns, often competing fiercely with equally hungry civilians for scraps. Ammunition, every single round, was carefully hoarded, each a precious, irreplaceable commodity, a testament to the increasingly futile and desperate nature of their continued resistance. This acute and prolonged lack of basic necessities gnawed relentlessly at the morale of the German soldiers, eroding their will to fight far more effectively than any Allied bombardment. A palpable sense of profound despair began to settle over the trapped forces. The initial shock of encirclement, the bewildering speed of the Allied advance, gave way to a dawning, terrible realization that their cause was irrevocably, utterly lost. Years of relentless propaganda and indoctrination, once so potent, began to crack and crumble under the crushing pressure of undeniable reality. Morale, once artificially bolstered by fervent belief in a miraculous counter-offensive, or the fabled, non-existent wonder weapons, evaporated like mist in the harsh spring sun. The internal conflict within the ranks was stark and wrenching. The ingrained discipline of the German military, a bedrock of its formidable reputation throughout the early war years, clashed violently with the primal, overwhelming instinct for individual survival. While some fanatical elements, often SS remnants or hardline officers, clung to the last, insane vestiges of Hitler's fight-to-the-death orders, a growing silent majority of pragmatists began to question the sanity, indeed the very morality, of further, pointless resistance. Each shell that landed, each pang of hunger, each frozen night spent without shelter, chipped away at their resolve. Amidst this suffocating despair, whispers began to circulate like wildfire among the retreating fragmented units, passed from man to man in hushed, urgent tones, like contraband knowledge. These were not rumors of secret weapons or impending relief columns, but of survival, of escape from the inferno. The most persistent, the most compelling, and ultimately the most powerful of these whispers coalesced into a stark, unforgettable directive. Head west, the Americans feed prisoners. East lies Siberia. This phrase, crude in its simplicity and stark in its implications, encapsulated the impossible, terrifying choice facing every German soldier. The Western Allies, particularly the Americans and British, were perceived as adhering strictly to the Geneva Conventions, offering the remote possibility of humane treatment, regular, if basic, food, and eventual repatriation, albeit after an unknown period of internment. In stark and terrifying contrast, the Red Army, advancing relentlessly from the east, was feared with an almost existential dread. The horrors of the Eastern Front, the brutal fighting, the unimaginable suffering, and the well-documented atrocities committed by German forces against Soviet civilians and soldiers had created a terrifying specter of reprisal. For many Germans, capture by the Soviets meant not just imprisonment, but brutal forced labor in the gulags, unimaginable suffering in the vast, unforgiving expanses of Siberia, and a near-certain, agonizing death. This fear was profound, deeply ingrained in the German psyche, and entirely rational given the historical context of the barbarity of the war on the Eastern Front. It was against this backdrop of utter futility and widespread paralyzing terror that Field Marshal Model made his pivotal, career-defining decision on April 15th. Isolated, with no hope of external support, and witnessing the utter disintegration of his command into a starving, demoralized mob, he took the extraordinary, almost rebellious step of dissolving Army Group B. This was not a formal surrender. Such an act would have been deemed high treason in the eyes of Hitler and his rapidly shrinking inner circle, and a fundamental violation of Model's own deep-seated loyalty to his military oath. Instead, it was a tacit, unspoken order for capitulation, a deliberate act designed to release his soldiers from the bonds of military discipline and their oaths without explicitly defying the Führer. By dissolving his command, Model effectively communicated to his men, "You are on your own, save yourselves." It was a desperate act of mercy from a commander who, despite his own iron will, understood that further, pointless resistance would only lead to a senseless, horrific slaughter of his remaining troops. The message, though implied rather than stated, was devastatingly clear. The war was over for them, and their absolute priority should now be personal survival. This subtle yet profoundly impactful act by Model transformed the desperate rumors into an unofficial, yet universally understood command that swept through the pocket. The phrase, "Walk west and surrender to the first Americans you see," solidified into a guiding, life-saving principle for the hundreds of thousands trapped within the pocket. This wasn't a formal chain of command order. There was no order issued on paper, no explicit directive from high command. Instead, it was a desperate, pragmatic instruction that spread rapidly and organically through the fractured and demoralized German units. It propagated through exhausted whispers in waterlogged foxholes, through hurried, anxious conversations in ravaged villages, and through the sheer, undeniable, self-preserving logic of its message. For the German soldiers, the psychological shift was monumental and instantaneous. Their fight was no longer for the glory of the Reich, no longer for a dying ideology, but for their own individual lives, for the chance to see another day, another week, perhaps even their families again. It marked a crucial transition from ideological combatants, bound by an increasingly meaningless cause, to desperate individuals, each driven by the singular, powerful, and utterly human instinct to survive the cataclysm that was consuming their world. The scenes that unfolded across the breadth of the Ruhr Pocket were a powerful, poignant, and almost unbelievable testament to the utter disintegration of a once mighty and feared army. It was an exodus unlike any other in history, a mass movement of humanity no longer marching to battle, no longer driven by military objectives, but propelled by a desperate, last-ditch effort to surrender. Columns of disheveled, exhausted German soldiers snaked endlessly through the ruined towns, across the cratered fields, and along the devastated countryside, their previous military precision and formidable organization replaced by a ragged, disorganized shuffle, the most potent visual metaphor of their abandonment of the Nazi regime and the war itself was the widespread, almost ritualistic act of burning insignia and discarding weapons. Field caps and uniforms, once worn with such fierce pride, were stripped of their eagles and swastikas, the hateful symbols consumed by small, defiant fires, or torn off and trampled into the mud. Rifles, machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and even personal sidearms were discarded in ditches, piled in heaps, or smashed against trees and rocks, rendered useless, no longer instruments of war, but heavy, cumbersome burdens. Some desperate soldiers, hoping to blend into the civilian population, or to appear less like combatants, attempted to shed their uniforms entirely, swapping them for any civilian clothes they could scavenge from abandoned houses or deserted villages, a stark, visceral image of their eagerness to erase their military identity and simply disappear. They threw away letters, photos, or anything that might link them too closely to the Nazi Party or wartime atrocities. Among the marching masses were countless individual journeys, each a deeply personal story of fear, despair, and the powerful, all-consuming instinct for survival. Consider a young Wehrmacht soldier, perhaps named Heinrich, barely out of his teens, his uniform caked with mud and dust, his eyes hollow with fatigue and shock. For years, he had been taught to fight with unwavering loyalty for the Führer and the fatherland, indoctrinated with tales of German superiority. But now all that remained was a profound, aching sense of disillusionment. He had seen too much death, too much destruction, too much meaningless sacrifice, and the orders to fight to the last man felt like a cruel, macabre joke. His decision to break ranks, to join the westward tide of surrender, was agonizing in its moral implications, yet utterly simple in its pragmatic necessity. It was the raw choice for life over a senseless, futile sacrifice. His hopes were not for victory, which was now impossible, but for mere survival, for the promise of basic food and shelter, however temporary, however humiliating. Beside him, perhaps, shuffled an elderly Volkssturm militiaman, a man named Gustav, his improvised uniform ill-fitting, his face etched with a weariness that went far beyond mere physical exhaustion. He was far too old for this brutal war, forcibly pulled from his civilian life, his small farm or his modest shop, to defend a crumbling empire. He likely had a family waiting somewhere, perhaps in a distant village untouched by the immediate fighting, or perhaps in a city reduced to pulverized rubble. For him, the march westward was tinged with a profound sense of personal failure, of having been forced to participate in a losing cause, yet also an almost overwhelming wave of relief. Relief that the fight was finally over, that he might yet escape the carnage and return to what little remained of his fractured life. Further back in the column, a Luftwaffe flak crewman, perhaps a corporal named Klaus, whose highly technical skills were now utterly useless, might reflect on the sheer futility of their past, courageous efforts. They had once bravely defended the skies over Germany, operating complex anti-aircraft batteries, but now those skies were entirely owned by the Allies, filled with their bombers and fighters. The fervent ideological conviction that once fueled their dedication had long since burned out, replaced by a cold, hard, desperate pragmatism. The choice to surrender was not about heroism or glory, but about making the most rational, most human decision in an utterly irrational, inhuman world. They sought not to die gloriously, but simply to escape the ceaseless cycle of violence and destruction. One might even imagine a junior officer, Lieutenant Schmidt, attempting initially to maintain some semblance of order, to uphold the military code, before succumbing to the overwhelming, irresistible tide of despair and surrender, his own sense of duty breaking under the weight of sheer numbers. These myriad individual narratives, whether real or imagined, woven together, formed a rich, tragic tapestry of desperation, resignation, and a profound, shared desire for peace. There were countless interactions too, brief, strained exchanges between these disparate types of soldiers, and even with the few remaining trapped civilians, all sharing a single common desire: to reach the American lines, to find safety, to simply endure. The march westward itself was an extraordinary, almost surreal spectacle of human desperation. It was a chaotic, disorganized movement, a massive, meandering stream of humanity, driven by a singular, overriding purpose. The physical conditions were brutally harsh. Soldiers, already severely weakened by prolonged combat, constant fear, and acute starvation, tramped for miles on end, often through cold spring rains and over bombed-out, impassable roads. The psychological toll was immense. A profound, almost spiritual relief at having finally abandoned the futile fight was strangely mingled with a pervasive sense of profound shame, the shame of defeat, of abandoning their comrades, of breaking their military oaths. Uncertainty hung heavy and suffocating in the air. Would the Americans truly treat them humanely, as the rumors promised? Would they even manage to reach the American lines? Or would they be intercepted by fanatical SS units still enforcing Hitler's brutal no-surrender policies, or perhaps even by Allied fire? The omnipresent fear of being caught between retreating German hardliners and advancing Allied forces was a very real, terrifying threat. Yet, despite the chaos and the deeply personal internal conflicts, the sheer scale of humanity moving, hundreds of thousands of people, created its own grim, unstoppable momentum. A silent, weary tide of surrender rolling inexorably towards the west, towards the uncertain promise of an end. When these ragged, desperate columns of German soldiers finally reached the American lines, the initial reaction from the Allied forces was a bewildering mixture of surprise, disbelief, and a cautious, almost stunned acceptance. American GIs, who had been locked in brutal, bloody combat with these very men for weeks, facing determined resistance and ambushes, suddenly found themselves confronting not fierce opposition, but an overwhelming flood of exhausted, demoralized individuals actively seeking surrender. The sheer volume of Germans pouring out of the Ruhr Pocket was utterly unprecedented in modern warfare, instantly transforming what had been a relentless combat mission into a massive, bewildering prisoner processing operation almost overnight. The Allied war departments had, of course, planned for taking prisoners, but not for collecting and managing an entire army of over 300,000 men. This was a logistical challenge of entirely new proportions, testing even the well-oiled American supply chains that had powered operations like the Red Ball Express. The immense challenge of handling this unexpected deluge of surrendering Germans fell primarily to two key figures: General Courtney Hodges of the 1st U.S. Army and General William Simpson of the 9th U.S. Army. They faced an immediate and utterly overwhelming logistical nightmare. How could they possibly feed, house, guard, and process 325,000 men, a number equivalent to several full Army corps, who were now their direct responsibility, not as enemies, but as wards? There were simply no pre-existing facilities capable of accommodating such a massive, sudden influx of humanity. Hasty measures were implemented with astonishing speed and improvisation, a testament to American resourcefulness under pressure. Vast temporary enclosures, soon to be infamously known as the Rhine Meadow Camps, or Rheinwiesenlager, were quickly established along the banks of the Rhine. These were often nothing more than immense open fields, cordoned off by miles of hastily erected barbed wire fencing, with minimal shelter, rudimentary sanitation, or efficient food distribution capabilities. The conditions were basic, primitive, and often harsh, but they represented a necessary, immediate, and overwhelming response to an unforeseen humanitarian crisis on an epic scale, driven by military expediency. Life inside these Rhine Meadow camps was a stark, brutal reality for the newly captured POWs. Their initial impressions were complex, a swirling mix of emotions. There was an undeniable sense of profound relief. They had escaped the horrific fighting, the acute starvation, the crushing fear, and the terrifying prospect of Soviet capture. But this initial relief was quickly tempered and overwhelmed by the sheer discomfort, the extreme hunger that gnawed at their stomachs, and the shocking overcrowding. Thousands upon thousands of men were crammed into open fields, often without even basic tents, exposed mercilessly to the chilling, unpredictable spring weather. Food, when it did arrive, was meager, often just enough to sustain bare life, a far cry from what the Americans feed prisoners rumor had perhaps implied. Yet for all the hardship, for all the indignity of captivity, for all the squalor, it was undeniably, unequivocally better than the terrifying alternative they had so desperately fled. The rumors they had followed, that the Americans feed prisoners, began to be confirmed, however minimally, however harshly. The very fact that they were being fed at all, however meagerly, and housed, however primitively, solidified their desperate gamble as the right choice, the life-saving decision. This stark reality in the Rhine Meadow camps served to reinforce the overarching terrifying theme that had driven their mass surrender. The pervasive fear of Siberia, the deep-seated terror of Soviet capture, and the brutal, often fatal treatment meted out to POWs on the Eastern Front stood in brutal, undeniable contrast to their current circumstances. While the American treatment was certainly harsh, lacking in comforts and far from ideal, it was, crucially, not a guaranteed death sentence. It was not the barbarity, the vengeful retribution they had anticipated from the East. The very existence of these camps, however rudimentary and controversial they later became, affirmed that their desperate gamble had paid off. They had chosen survival, and in the hands of the Americans they had found it, solidifying their belief that their decision to head west was not just pragmatic, but utterly life-saving. Meanwhile, the Red Army's advance continued its inexorable push towards Berlin, and with it, the terrifying stories of retribution and hardship for those captured on the Eastern Front continued to filter back, further validating the fateful choices made by the men of the Ruhr Pocket. The 18th of April, 1945, marked a pivotal and conclusive moment in the frantic final days of World War II in Europe. On this date, organized German resistance within the vast Ruhr Pocket officially collapsed. The last scattered pockets of determined fanatical fighters were finally overwhelmed, often by sheer weight of numbers and firepower, and the remaining utterly disheartened units simply laid down their arms en masse. It was a dramatic, definitive, and strangely quiet conclusion to one of the largest encirclement battles in history, a battle that ended not with a final, glorious, heroic charge, but with a weary, collective sigh of surrender, a profound admission of absolute defeat. The immediate tactical victory for the Allies was immense, securing a massive haul of prisoners and eliminating a huge enemy force. But the broader strategic implications, the long-term echoes of this event, were even more profound, accelerating the end of the entire European conflict. With the Ruhr Pocket emptied of its hundreds of thousands of defenders, a massive strategic obstacle that had tied down significant Allied resources was suddenly, definitively removed. Patton's Third Army, a relentless, highly mobile force that had been pushing east with astonishing speed and aggression, was now freed to accelerate its advance even deeper into the German heartland, encountering significantly less organized resistance. The removal of such a vast concentration of German troops, even demoralized and undersupplied ones, allowed the Allied front to sweep forward almost unimpeded, hastening the inevitable final offensive towards Berlin. Beyond the immediate military gains, the emptying of Germany's industrial heartland represented a fatal, crippling blow to any lingering German war-making capability. The Ruhr Valley, a traditional engine of German economic might and military production, was now not only captured, but also effectively devoid of its vital industrial labor force, its factories silenced or destroyed. It was a symbolic and practical crippling of the Third Reich's economic and military foundations, signaling an end to any possibility of continued resistance. The mass surrender in the Ruhr Pocket became far more than just another military defeat. It was a profound psychological turning point for both sides. For the Germans, it shattered any last desperate illusions of defending the fatherland, or of a miraculous turn of events. The sheer, unprecedented scale of the surrender was an undeniable, irrefutable signal that the war was truly, utterly lost. For the Allies, it was a confirmation of their overwhelming dominance and a clear harbinger of the conflict's imminent conclusion. The almost surreal sight of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, once proud and unyielding, now marching quietly into captivity, their spirit broken, sent an unmistakable, powerful message across the continent. The Third Reich was not just faltering, it was crumbling, disintegrating before their eyes. For the prisoners of war themselves, the immediate aftermath was a complex, emotionally charged blend of exhaustion, profound relief, and deep, gnawing uncertainty. They had survived, a monumental feat many had thought impossible just days before. They were fed, however sparingly, and crucially, they were protected from the continued horrors of the front lines. Yet they were also prisoners, their freedom gone, their future utterly uncertain. They carried the heavy collective burden of defeat, the deep shame of a nation that had brought the world to its knees and was now itself utterly prostrate. The psychological wounds of war, and of such a comprehensive, humiliating defeat, would linger long after their eventual release. The Ruhr Pocket surrender marked the beginning of a long and arduous journey for these men, a road that would eventually lead, for many, back to a shattered homeland and the daunting, overwhelming task of rebuilding their lives and their country from the ashes of total war. They would face years of screening, denazification, and the slow, painful process of reintegration into a society fundamentally altered by their defeat. The Ruhr Pocket surrender stands as one of the most remarkable and, in some ways paradoxically overlooked non-combat events of World War II. It was a military victory achieved not through the thunder of artillery or the spectacular clash of tanks, but through the overwhelming, relentless weight of Allied power, the utter exhaustion and demoralization of the German military machine, and the desperate, pragmatic choices made by hundreds of thousands of individual soldiers who simply wanted to live. This epic, almost silent capitulation underscores the profound and often underappreciated power of rumor and individual decision-making in the crucible of total war. A simple, stark phrase, "Walk west and surrender to the first Americans you see," passed from mouth to mouth, became an almost sacred lifeline, a collective directive that shaped the fate of an entire army, altering the course of the war's final weeks. It was a testament to the fact that even in the most rigid, most ideologically driven military structures, the primal, overwhelming human instinct for survival can ultimately override all other directives, all other loyalties. The event powerfully highlights humanity's enduring drive to live, to escape the insatiable maw of destruction, even in the face of absolute, undeniable defeat. It was a moment when the basic will to live triumphed decisively over the imposed will to fight to the last man. In a war characterized by unimaginable violence, by grand, destructive battles, and by relentless, bloody attrition, the mass surrender in the Ruhr Pocket represents a quiet, almost understated yet hugely significant end for a massive portion of the German army. It was a surrender not forced by a final, decisive engagement of arms, but by the sheer, undeniable and brutal logic of hopelessness. This unique place in history reminds us that victory is not always forged solely in the heat of battle, but sometimes, profoundly, in the cold, desperate calculations of those who finally realize their fight is utterly, irrevocably lost, and their only remaining, human option is to choose life. The logistics of war, as the Red Ball Express showed, were about moving supplies to continue the fight. Here, logistics became about the challenge of containing and processing an entire army that had decided the fight was over, a different but equally monumental test of industrial capacity and organizational skill. It marked the end of an era, not with a bang, but with the shuffling footsteps of 325,000 men seeking peace. If you found this deep dive into the Ruhr Pocket surrender compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel for more untold stories from history. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you.